Welcome to the first session of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Volunteer Training here at Live Arts. My name is T. Ames. I'm the Education Director here at Live Arts, and I'm really excited about today's topic. DEI work is incredibly important to me for a lot of reasons, and I'll go into my qualifications and all of that in a little bit. But specifically today, we're going to be talking about power dynamics in theatrical spaces, and we're going to start that conversation because it's a way longer conversation than we can cover in an hour. So to begin, I just want to go over the agenda for today. We'll start with introductions. So who I am, a little bit more about my background in DEI and work with DEI. We'll talk more about the guidelines for today's workshop. The presentation aspect of today will take about half an hour or so. So we'll cover topics like progress, prejudice, and power. We'll talk about agents and targets, and then first steps towards equity when in the midst of talking about all of those things. Then I will mention what next session's topics are. So hopefully the next session will be February or March. And then we'll have time for questions and dialogue, and really just call and responding with today's topic. All right, so to begin, as I said before, my name is T. Ames. I'm the Education Director here at Live Arts. I have a BA in Theater and Africana Studies with high honors from Oberlin College. That whole experience for me really is where my DEI journey started. I like to joke around and tell people that I majored in Black theater, and I majored in equity and diversity and inclusion work within theatrical spaces. My professors were very focused on making sure that we all knew what it meant to be Black in theater, what it meant to have privilege and not have privilege and power in theater, and then how to create more equitable collaborative spaces within theater in moments like this. Oh, beautiful. So nice to see some Oberlin connections. I've also taken workshops with Theater Intimacy Education, which is a world-renowned program that deals with intimacy, consent, and boundary training within theatrical spaces, mainly in America, but they have traveled internationally and have been recognized internationally as well. I have done several collaborations with Dr. Kelly Palmer of Idea Minds here in Charlottesville, as well as with Matthew Reynolds of Matthew Reynolds Consulting. Both Dr. Palmer and Matthew have done a lot of work with Live Arts. So it's exciting to be able to share some of the same things that I'm sure they have already shared with the board. So it's very exciting to be able to sort of bring those worlds together in today's session. I also served as an African-American history teacher at a local high school here in Charlottesville for 2 years. And during one of those years, I was the faculty DEI coordinator. So we spent a lot of time talking about DEI work within schools. What I really loved about teaching Black history was that I used Black history as a case study. So I curated my curriculum with the DEI lens, making sure that everyone in the class, from student to teacher to supervisors to the principal to visitors, understood how we as a society came to be and how that affects Black history as a whole. So yeah, it's a little bit about me, a little bit why I know what I'm talking about. I've lived what I'm talking about, and I continue to experience what we're talking about, as we all do in some way, shape, or form. All right, so session guidelines, I mentioned these in the email that was sent out, but just to review them, I do ask that all participants keep themselves muted and with video off for the presentation aspect, and then we'll have time after the presentation for questions and dialogue, which I'm really excited about. Please take notes, whatever that might mean for you. If it's easier for you to sit back and just sort of absorb and then watch the recording later, please feel free to do so. That's totally fine. Some people, it's more accessible to write things. Sometimes it's more accessible to hear it more than once. Whatever works for you, please go ahead and do that. I also ask that you please listen for the sake of comprehension and not response. What's really important about that difference there is that listening for comprehension comes out of an equitable space and a space of collaboration, rather than response comes out of a place of inherent privilege and bias and power dynamics, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So taking that time to really just digest what you're hearing rather than feeling like you have to immediately be defensive about what you're hearing is really important here. Speaking of things like defensiveness, it is okay to be uncomfortable. It's actually important to be uncomfortable because comfort is very much a privilege in our society. So embracing any and all feelings that come to you during this presentation and during our dialogue, I highly, highly encourage. I love talking about this work. It's not always the easiest thing to talk about, but it's important that we all hear it every so often just to normalize these conversations and make sure that we all continue to learn, because learning and continuing to gain knowledge is how we enact change and enact that knowledge in the world that we live in. No matter what, your perspective of what's going on today is valid. It makes a lot of sense. And as we go forward with these sessions, we'll break down what those things really mean and how we can then tackle that in our everyday lives and essentially here at Live Arts as well. All right, so to start off for today, theater is subjective, except for when it isn't. It's really interesting working in a theater and being in theatrical spaces a lot of the time because we assume that whenever we walk into a theater, that everyone understands that, hey, we're all here coming with our different perspectives to build something great, to make something great. Some people might love what we're doing, other people might not, and that's okay. That is true to an extent. Unfortunately, given how the Western society has been crafted historically, as proven to have worked and continues to evolve in that direction, theater, which is a product of our society, has become more objective. So we love to think that collaboration and sharing ideas is what we're really about in theater, but unfortunately it tends to be more on the objective side than the subjective. And we'll talk about how that influenced us and how that came to be as we continue forward today. So a question that Matthew Reynolds loves to pose to folks in their workshops, but also just in everyday conversation, is how much of your thinking is your thinking? And by that, they always meant how much of what you know is influenced by who you are and how you've been raised versus who you interact with on a daily basis versus how society treats us versus how we perceive ourselves versus how others perceive us. There are all these factors that influence how we develop ideas and thoughts and feelings about the world around us and about the people around us. So in DEI work, it's so important to constantly ask yourself, how much of what I'm thinking is actually me thinking and generating these ideas, and how much of that is me being influenced by what I'm perceiving and how I'm being perceived? That being said, everyone's thought process is different. Everyone's upbringing is different. So this is an incredibly diverse way of thinking about life. And it can get a little existential at times, but we're going to ground that today with the presentation. So just starting with that question is really important because it starts us on this journey of how does how I think about the world influence how I think about theater, how I think about theatrical spaces and the people that are in those spaces. So Western ideology, it can be really complicated, but here's what it boils down to. And here's how I broke it down to my high schoolers. Western ideology, meaning the Western world, so not the Eastern world, but the Western world that dominates and colonizes the Eastern world, is all based around a unified society with unified values. And within that unified society with those unified values, progress is allowed because we're moving towards even more unification within that society itself. Now, that is when this idea of subjectivity versus objectivity comes into play, because then we're talking about individuals who have aligned values and unified values, creating a sense of binary thinking, which introduces power as a major factor within progress and within Western ideology. So I'm going to break that down once more. Progress, if we're redefining it, basically means that those with the most power are aiming towards unification with unified values within a polarized or binary society, country, or world as we continue to move forward. Okay, so because these binaries are created and progress keeps us moving forward in some way, shape, or form, that means that we are becoming even more polarized because there are always going to be people who don't necessarily agree with us. But because of how binaries work and because power becomes a factor within these binaries, then we suddenly see that there's a right way of doing things and a wrong way of doing things, a good way of doing things, a bad way of doing things. And we get stuck in this very rigid way of thinking about life. Now, this is specifically inherent to Western ideology because Eastern ideology is based off of a community perspective, rather than Western ideology is an individual perspective. And again, that individual perspective is that unified society with those unified values. And you are only allowed to be an individual if you also are adhering within those, or the boundaries of that thinking of being an individual are within that unified community and unified society that thinks the same. And if you are against that or do not necessarily believe that, then you are on the wrong side of history, is another way of putting that. Now, as we continue forward, I want to make it very clear that what I'm describing is the basics of DEI theory, and we're going to be applying that to theater, which again is not necessarily always a cut and dry world to exist in and to work in. So as we translate this to theater, I'll make sure that we're crafting the conversation to where those boundaries make a little bit more sense within theatrical spaces. All right, so when progress creates a distinct binary, we get agents and we get targets, also known as we get dominant groups and minority groups. Within those dominant groups, within those agent groups, agents can use their power over others to maintain the progress that's been made with that unified society in that Western culture, in that Western society. Targets have power used against them by the agents. And because they are on the other side of that binary, they are considered the ones who are impeding that sense of progress. They are not working within the unified values of that society. Hence, they are considered the ones that are going against and butting heads with the agents. Important things to know about agents and targets. Agents will always hold power over targets. Targets will always have that power used against them. Generally speaking, one of the agent's biggest fears is becoming a target because they see how targets are treated in society because they are impeding that progress, whether it is active or passive, just because of how they're being labeled. And how they become labeled is where we get this idea of progress in Western theater, okay? So when we think about Western theater as a subject matter, so like Western theater history, in an undergrad classroom, we're thinking about the ancient Greek origins of, you've got the big, rich leaders of a society who have paid actors and paid playwrights to write propaganda for a society for entertainment, for indoctrination, and to keep everyone on the same page with that unified society and unified values. Because that is where our theater tradition comes from in the Western world, that in and of itself does not leave space for collaboration. So in our society now, when we talk about trying to create a more collaborative space in theater, it's sometimes hard to do that because we're not really remembering where theater came from in the first place in our society. It was never meant to be collaborative. It was always meant to be the agent or the dominant group asserting power over targets in the name of entertainment, in the name of propaganda. So you've got these homogenous theatrical spaces, and that stifles creativity, it stifles dialogue and perspective in that space. AKA, the agents will always have that power because that was the entire point in the first place. And this can create inherent prejudices that are based in these Western theater traditions. One of the biggest examples I can think of with this, growing up in theater, I was always told that what I now know to be abusive theater environments or rehearsal environments, so being yelled at constantly, being pushed against my boundaries, people not respecting or asking for consent in a space. That was intense work. That was heavy work. That was the good work that created good, amazing, intense plays that people just love to watch. What was not being acknowledged was that the target in the room, myself as an actor, did not have the space or the freedom or the privilege to say, this is making me uncomfortable. I don't feel like I should be crying in this moment because you've pushed me to cry, because that's what you feel like this needs to create that view or the story that is going to be the most useful and the most biting and intense for an audience to watch and receive. So I mentioned prejudice. Prejudice is an important part of this conversation. Prejudice within a Western world occurs when perceived stereotypes are informed by that dominant group towards a minority group, or informed by an agent toward a target. Now, again, agents can be a lot of things, targets can be a lot of things, and we'll talk about where they interlap as we move forward. But what's important about prejudice here is that it definitely encourages that binary thinking as the agents hold power over targets. So examples of this, there are incredible stereotypes of how actors act within theatrical spaces, how directors act, how the business side or staff members of a theater act when it comes to their volunteers, when it comes to the members of the community that they are serving or say to be serving, because that agent target dynamic is still in place, because that's where Western theater started in the first place. It's where we're all getting all this information from and how we're moving forward. That's the exact translation that we're using. We're trying to do something different with DEI being a lens that we're using, but it gets a little complicated because we're trying to create non-binary systems within a binary system. And that's when things get super complicated. And prejudice becomes a big part of that, because we assume that we know what's going on and that we're putting those assumptions onto target or minority groups against their will. And they don't have the privilege to necessarily change that. So our work should be about dismantling these systems so that a collaborative process can be possible, so that these prejudices can be disengaged, so that we can really understand where we're coming from in the first place. All right, so there's two definitions of power that are really important when we're talking about DEI work. There's the general sense of power, and that's just basically the access and control that can be granted to dominant groups or agents. It's that simple. Those in positions of power have access and control at any and all times. And yes, that's usually when we're talking about an agent group. Institutional power is that perceived entitlement to that access and control. And that entitlement is embedded within the institutional memory of that society. And by society, that could mean the business, that could be the business model, that could be the people that are involved in that business, the history of that business. It's more than just society at large. It could very much be just the theater itself and how that theater has been run. So progress, when it comes to power, they work hand in hand, because we are perpetuating the same institutional memories of how power has been used in a theatrical space as we continue to move forward. And again, we're working on trying to dismantle those systems of power, because they're not very helpful anymore. We're realizing how targets and minority groups are not being helped, how they do not have a voice as much as we would love them to have one. And the reason why this gets so complicated so fast is because these systems of institutional power have been at play for as long as these institutions have been around. So it's going to take that much time, if not more, to start to dismantle them and see things from a different perspective. And we have to build those habits of understanding these definitions and moving forward with the knowledge in mind. I'm just going to keep it there for a second. All right. So very important definition. Institutional power, aka that the fact that agents are granted that access and control and having that access embedded in society, plus prejudice, plus the fact that agents can enforce stereotypes over targets, is where we get oppression. Institutional power plus prejudice equals oppression. And oppression is any and all of the isms that we know very well. Things like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, neurodiversity, and prejudices against neurodiversity, and oppression of those with neurodivergency. All of those things fit under this umbrella. What's important to remember about this equation is that it can apply to any parts of our life. So here I have just a few examples of agent-target dynamics that may exist within a theatrical space. We've got the ones that are a little bit more obvious. We've got directors and actors. A director will be considered an agent because they're the one who have the power in the situation. And actors will be considered the target because they don't have as much of that power. They are a minority in that space. The director is going to wield that power, hopefully healthily in that space, but we can see where that dynamic takes place. We see the same things with staff members and volunteers, where staff members are agents and volunteers can be targets. Adults and minors, that seems a little self-explanatory, but again, adults have that power to make decisions and minors don't have that power. They are impeding that progress because they just don't know. They are minors. We have stage managers and actors, supervisors and supervisees, production teams and theater staff. Sometimes that goes both ways, depending on the situation and how these ideas are being implemented into whatever we're talking about. And of course, we have to remember the interpersonal dynamics that influence all of this. And I'm about to get into that. All right. Agent-target dynamics in theater are amplified in theatrical spaces, mainly because we care so much about what we do. So we walk into a rehearsal room and these sorts of agent-target dynamics become heightened. They become larger than life because we are so passionate about the job that we're doing. These dynamics do not exist outside of the theater, and they're not as conflated because these are normalized in our everyday society. But because theater is this high form of art, the exact ideas of power and progress and prejudice and oppression become even more intense than they are in our everyday lives, simply because we step foot in a rehearsal space or a production meeting. The energy that we're putting towards these things is what makes it that intense for us. Just want to put that out there. It's not anyone's fault. It's how we have grown to love what we do. And because these are systems that have been at play for centuries, and it's none of our faults that they are that way, they just become perpetuated in that sense. Then those dynamics between directors and actors, between board members and volunteers or staff members, they are embedded in who we are, because we care as much as we do. And so all of the things that are happening, any issues or problems with those dynamics, seem like the biggest issue on the planet because of how much we want to do our jobs well. We'll talk more about that in the dialogue sense. So, some important things to remember when we're having these conversations. Nothing and no one exists in a vacuum. Okay, this is not Disney. This is not an animation where the evil ones are always evil and the innocent are always innocent. We are all direct products of our environments. Those environments can be things like cultural upbringing. It could be things like the isms we were talking about. So race, gender, sexuality, ability, neurodivergence, and class. It could be our just general personality traits. It could be, and it's a big one, influenced by personal and historical traumas as well. Some parts of our identity will always classify us as a part of a dominant group. And other parts of our identities will always classify us as a part of a minority group. And this is part of why diversity and defining diversity is so important to who we are. So I'll use myself as an example. I am a target in a lot of ways. As a Black person, as a non-binary person, as a queer person, as a neurodivergent person. I don't have a lot of privileges in a lot of spaces. However, I am also a middle-class person. I have health insurance. I have a full-time job. I'm in a position of power in a wonderful theater that a lot of people see as influential in Charlottesville society. So I absolutely have power. I absolutely am also an agent. And those two things both define my job and how I how I interact with people and how I'm perceived and how I can do my job. So I have to be self-aware, call myself out and call myself back in again and say, hey, you might be an agent in this situation because of X, Y, and Z, because you are being influenced by these unified values and trying to progress and move forward in this direction, versus other folks who are targets who I might not mean to be using these systems against, but that's just naturally what happens because that's how our society has always worked. It's how we've all been trained and taught to operate within this society. So the first step to figuring out all of this, to create those equitable spaces, is just acknowledging who we are and that we are exactly who we need to be in this moment in time to start making those changes. We don't necessarily need to change who we are right now to be able to acknowledge the systems that are at play, who we are and how we are influenced by that system. It's none of our faults, but it does become our fault when we acknowledge and then we don't do anything. So when we notice there's a problem in a theatrical space, in a rehearsal room, in a production meeting, in a board meeting, and we don't speak up, that is when issues arise. We are all targets, we are all agents, and that's okay. That is absolutely okay. That binary way of thinking is not anyone's fault. It's just the way that our system works. So creating equity in the spaces that we're inhabiting, as I said, first, we must acknowledge those systems. When are we agents? When are we targets? Who have historically been the agents and the targets in the history of the institution that we're a part of? Now that, again, can be live arts, the institution. It could be Charlottesville society. It could be Virginia state government. It could be our federal government. It could be the world at large, because they all are controlled and understood within this Western dynamic and within that Western ideology of how progress and power work together. That second step after acknowledging is learning to treat people how they want to be treated. Or another way of saying that, treating people how they tell you they want to be treated. Assumed consent and boundaries does not equal communicated consent and boundaries. I know a lot of us were taught when we were growing up, the golden rule is how we need to start thinking about the world and why it's important to have respect and empathy for one another. I adhere more to the platinum rule, this idea of treating people how they ask and tell you that they need and want to be treated. Because again, we are not a monolith as a society. We all have different upbringings and all have different ways of interacting with each other, and how those things influence how we treat ourselves and the world around us as well. So as agents in certain scenarios, it is my job to make space for a target or minority group to be able to communicate those consents, whatever is consensual for them and whatever their boundaries are. And in other spaces, when I'm our target, it is the agent's responsibility in that moment to create that space so that I can communicate my boundaries and what is consensual and what's not. So I want to go back to this again. I just gave a couple examples there, but even supervisor and supervisee, this should be a two-way street of, as the agent, I know I have the power and the privilege in this scenario. So it is my job, because I hold that power, to make that space so that the target or minority group can say or do whatever they need to in that moment to make sure that we are understood and that we can respect each other based on where we're coming from. Because that's the only way that we're going to be able to move forward with the DEI lens in a theatrical space. It's not easy. It's not always fun. It's not always the thing that we want to do. It's the thing that we have to do if we want to start changing how we are running a theater, how we are operating in an everyday society. And again, theater imitates life in so many ways. But because we are all care so much about what we do, and those stakes seem so much higher in the theatrical space, it makes it even more important to be able to listen to one another, understand and empathize with where the other one's coming from, and giving targets that space to let us know what they need so that we can start dismantling these systems at play. All right. Our next session, we're going to be reviewing all that I talked about today. And then we're going to talk about how white supremacy culture and tenets of white supremacy influence these conversations, influence how we are trying to move forward and understand each other and how each other wants to be treated.